sorry, I'm not sharing my screen. I'll go back. For the benefit of those new to RSVP, I'm just going to say a few words about Michael before introducing our speaker for the lecture this year. So this lecture, delivered at the annual conference, was established in 1999 to honour the foundational role and lifetime contribution of Michael Wolff to the work of the Research Society for Victorian Periodicals. RSVP had been founded some 30 years earlier in 1968 at the MLA conference in New York by an interdisciplinary group of scholars led by Michael. He went on to become the first president of RSVP, serving from 1969 to 1973. Born in London and studying as an undergraduate at Cambridge, Michael moved to the United States in 1951, completing his MA and PhD at Princeton before his appointment to the English department at Indiana University in 1955 and later to the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. He was at the forefront of the new interdisciplinary field of Victorian studies in the 1950s as a co-founder of what became the premier journal in the field, Victorian Studies, in 1957. A decade later, his now famous essay, Charting the Golden Stream, Thoughts on a Directory of Victorian Periodicals, in that famous essay, he heralded the launch of a new phase in the historiography of the period, which would harness the vast range and number of Victorian newspapers and periodicals as a new and vital research archive. The first number of the Victorian Periodicals newsletter under Michael's editorship appeared in January 1968. It began as a sort of clearinghouse for information, ideas and projects related to Victorian periodicals and evolved into the major journal in the field that is now Victorian Periodicals Review. I first met Michael in Cambridge in 2001. I was a visiting fellow on sabbatical from my then home institution, the University of New England. It was the eve of Locating the Victorians, the vast international conference conceived by Michael and held at the Science Museum and Imperial College London to mark the centenary of Queen Victoria's death and to enable scholars to assess the legacy of the Victorian age in the 20th century. Typical of Michael, as I later came to appreciate, he had contacted me, an Aussie Victorianist who happened to be in Cambridge, because he was canvassing support for another collaborative venture beyond the 2001 event that would bring together Victorian studies associations in Europe, North America, and Australasia together to build upon the achievements of the conference. Michael's dedication to scholarly collaboration and his pioneering work in the study of Victorian periodicals remain hallmarks of RSVP today, as our 2022 conference, I think, is amply demonstrating. The list of Wolff lecturers over the past 2 decades is a catalogue of distinguished scholars in the field, and this year's lecturer rightly joins their number. Mark Turner is Professor of English at King's College London. His research interests are at the intersection of literary and visual studies and media history. He's the author of Trollope and the Magazines, 2000, and Backward Glances, Cruising the Queer Streets of New York and London, 2003. He's co-editor with John Stokes of the 2 volumes devoted to Oscar Wilde's journalism for the Oxford English Texts Collected Works Series, 2013. We heard a bit about that in one of the panels this afternoon. With Laurel Brake and Chandrika Kaur, he co-edited The News of the World in the British Press, 1843 to 2001, published in 2016. He's one of the founding editors of Media History, and he's the author of numerous book chapters and journal articles on 19th century literature, journalism, and popular culture. There are too many of these to mention, but I'd like to single out a group of essays that have really become seminal for anyone looking at serial form in Victorian print culture. They are Periodical Time in the 19th Century, published in 2002, Telling of My Weekly Doings, The Material Culture of the Novel in 2004, Companions, Supplements, and the Proliferation of Print in the 1830s, published in 2010, The Unruliness of Serials in the 19th Century and in the Digital Age in 2014, and most recently, Seriality, Miscellaneity, and Compression in 19th Century Print in 2020. And I have a feeling tonight's talk is going to need to be added to that number of seminal works. It is my great pleasure to invite Mark to give the 2022 Wolff Lecture.
Thank you, Kathy. That was a really lovely introduction. I really appreciate it. And it's nice to have you doing it. Let me begin firstly by just thanking the conference program committee for inviting me to give this year's Wolff Lecture. RSVP has been the intellectual home for my research in 19th century periodicals since I was a graduate student in the early 1990s. The first academic conference I ever attended was in Manchester in 1992. And since that time, I've gathered with colleagues, RSVP colleagues in such places as Edinburgh, London, twice, I think, New York in the fateful week of 9/11, Richmond, Brighton, Canterbury, Ghent, at least twice, possibly 3 times, Salford, Washington, New Haven, Freiburg, and on Zoom. The conversations I've had, the suggestions I've received in the talks and lectures I've heard at the annual conferences have all been enormously generative to my research. As you'll quickly realize, what follows today is steeped in the scholarship of RSVP colleagues in no small way. And it builds on the thinking that I've been doing about seriality and miscellaneity over the recent years. Much of this work can be traced back to stuff I'd published in VPR. So a heartfelt thank you for the program organizers for thinking of me, to Jennifer for formally inviting me, and thanks also to the RSVP community, which is a special and intellectually generous group of friends and scholars. It really is an honor to be delivering the Wolff Lecture, even from afar. So let me begin. There we go. And let me begin by framing what I'm talking about today. So much of my work in the field of periodicals and media history has focused on trying to understand the concept of seriality across the 19th century. That's led me to think about the serial in its various forms: the periodical, the newspaper, the serial novel, the book in series form, in an attempt to elaborate on what I've talked about as the culture of seriality in the 19th century, a conceptual approach that takes us beyond thinking about seriality as only a mode or an economic model of publication, though obviously seriality is both of those things as well. What I emphasize are the ways seriality provides shape and form to the proliferation of print across the 19th century. The logic of serial print is that it requires containment because of its propensity to expand. Many forms and formats were tried and tested, and as the press shifted alongside such diverse factors as technological innovation, syndication, distribution, and literacy, there were magazines and miscellanies, part issues, supplements, companions. There were guides, compendiums, handbooks, almanacs, and so on. And there were multiple and overlapping temporalities. As Jim Mussel notes, I have to remember to call him Jim Mussel, not just Jim, serials, quote, announce their seriality through appearances. That is, through the repetitions of format, through typeface, through layout, through departments. All of these formats are examples of what we call the serial, suggesting that serial form was not singular or discrete any more than it was fixed and stable. Each serial issue or installment is replaced by the next iteration in whatever temporal rhythm. But the serial is also imagined as long-term. It seems to go on and on. It projects a kind of endlessness. Both the ephemeral and the seemingly infinite are part of seriality. Well, recently I've been trying to think about the culture of miscellaneity alongside this culture of seriality. Elsewhere, I've described seriality and miscellaneity as the twin engines of print modernity, two forces that work in tandem, producing a dynamics for how we might conceptualize print culture broadly. Lurking behind this is an attempt to think about the relationship between print and the digital, and the larger research question of which this work forms a small but important part. Whoops. There we go. Is something like this. How is print linked to the digital through concepts and material operations that emerged across the long 19th century? I argue that the so-called digital age does not signal a break with earlier dynamics of print modernity. Instead, I want to suggest that the digital represents the diffusion, the extension, and automation of logics, techniques, and concepts that emerged through and simultaneously shaped mass, global, and industrialized print. So that's the sort of big picture behind what I'm talking about today. But what I'd like to do today is to bore down into one of the techniques of miscellaneity, something which defines much of 19th century serial print, and that's the technique of extraction. My approach today is twofold. Firstly, I think of this talk as synthetic. It brings together my and others' thinking about miscellaneity in an effort to present this concept in a macro sort of way. And partly what I want to do is to note the prevalence of miscellaneity across 19th century forms. So in a sense, just acknowledge it a bit more than we maybe have. But secondly, I think about this talk as diagnostic. By looking at the conceptual reach of miscellaneity, we might see something about the bigger picture of print culture and the uses to which it gets put. If the culture of seriality and print modernity was about proliferating and expanding in print, the culture of miscellaneity was all about brevity and selection. As a mixture, a medley, a bringing together of separate things, miscellaneity works against such ideas as wholeness and completeness, the sort of ideas that seriality seems to project. And it works through such ideas as extraction, reduction, and compression. Miscellaneity requires someone, an editor usually, to select, anthologize, and sample, but in the service of breadth and multiplicity, rather, I think, than singularity. It stands against the endlessness of new print by cutting through it, by offering us some small part of all that we might possibly read or know. Miscellaneity also requires us as readers to make our own selections about what is read and what is left behind. The difficulty with the culture of seriality is that there's an ever-increasing amount of the new produced through the many rhythms and cycles of publication. And this is a point that many of us gathered here today have written about in one way or another. This abundance of new print is one of the things that miscellaneity seems to address. In the face of the seemingly limitless amount of the new, and in the context of the increasingly industrial cycles of print production across the century, selectivity is required. It's a necessary form of containment. Underpinning all of these different forms and formats of miscellaneity, all of these container technologies, is some understanding of shortening, digesting, contracting, and extracting. But let's start with an example from early in the 19th century and some passages from the prospectus to the compiler. This is from 1807, Miscellanies, that signals its method and process through its title. The compiler, or literary banquet, consisting of interesting extracts of the most popular, scarce, and expensive works. This is what they say to themselves: inquiring curiosity of youth, the mature research of manhood, and the lighter taste of the female sex may all find gratification in the pages of the literary banquet, while the whole is made subservient to the noblest purposes of information and the best ends of morality. Then they go on to say, although this work is published in numbers and various articles necessarily continued from one number to another, yet it has been and shall continue to be our care to render this and every succeeding volume perfectly complete in itself. I simply want to point out two things here. The first is the link between miscellaneity and information, which continues and strengthens, I think, throughout the century. The second is the way the serial also has the permanence of the book still in mind. You note there the single column layout, for example, and its debt to other books for its miscellaneous content. So what they extract here are bits of books. The tension suggested here between seriality and incompleteness and miscellaneity and completeness is a running refrain in print throughout the period. And what I really want to do is tease out some questions that arise out of this culture of miscellaneity and the various processes of reducing and contracting. And really, I want to ask, how are we meant to think about those miscellaneous items that fill the pages of so many 19th century serials? What's their status as text or as representation or as abstraction? What are they doing there, if not simply taking up space on the page, acting as filler? And even if that is what they're doing there, and often that is, what do we do with them? Or the shorthand question might simply be miscellaneity, so what? Scissors and paste journalism is one of the defining characteristics of editorial and journalistic practice across the 19th century, beginning from about the 1820s and 30s, which saw such dynamic growth and innovation in cheap print. Scissors and paste is also what defines the culture of miscellaneity across the century. The DNCJ defines this widespread practice as excerpting from or recycling of articles from other publications. And in particular, we might think of news gathering in the provincial press, which relied on copy reprinted from the national press, whether from agreed syndication or outright piracy. But the metropolitan press was equally engaged in forms of excerpting. But excerpting, or what a number of serial miscellanies called extracting, included a variety of practices. Scissors and paste is an idea and a concept as much as it is a method, but it wasn't a singular kind of editorial practice that produced a singular form. Here's a publication that the DNCJ called first examples of scissor and paste journalism, one of the first periodicals, scissor and paste periodicals, The Thief from 1832, with its prospectus presented in the form of a scene from a play with the editor talking to a potential publisher, bookseller. In the first column there at the beginning, scene 21, Paternoster Row, time, morning. The editor says, "Sir, I've called upon you to know whether you will undertake the publishing of a new paper." The publisher says, "Well, what, sir? Another penny paper? Sir, my hands are so full of them that I've already burnt my fingers. But what is the name of your intended paper?" "The Thief," starting from his seat. "Make my shop a receptacle for stolen goods. This is too bad. Never, never." The editor, "Gently, sir, gently, not so fast. Is not published under the superintendence of the 40 thieves quite as good as published under the superintendence of the Society for Useful Knowledge? No slander against the Society's magazine, the most instructive. That is the very thing. They are all instructive and none amusing." And it goes on to say, the editor says, no, it is to be edited by the light-fingered gentry and will consequently contain no heavy articles. The magazines, the various periodicals will be our plunder. They will be, as it were, the shell and husk. We, the kernel of literature. They are the fatness, but we, the marrow of fatness. The publisher says, "But the original matter, the reviews, etc., the nonsense, my good friend. Who writes anything original nowadays? We only steal from them what they have stolen from others. And as for reviews without extracts, what are they to a person who has never read the books?" Two things stand out from this playful prospectus. The first is that the thief is going to veer away from what has been taken to be the primary function in miscellaneity, the representation of useful knowledge and instruction, as popularized in particular by the vast output of the SDUK and Charles Knight's sprawling network of print. Much of Knight's innovative developments in print, his companion to the newspaper, for example, in the 1830s, relied on forms of miscellaneity, extracting, excerpting, reduction, for the purposes of recirculating information and retrospectively selecting news after the fact. By contrast, the thief is chiefly designed to entertain. Secondly, the mode of the thief is wholly extractive. The wider field of serial literature is its source, its plunder, and originality is not part of the plan. We only steal what they have stolen from others, they write, in a suggestion that the whole expanse of serial print is underpinned by the movement and the shifting and repurposing of text from one form and format to another. It's as if Roland Barthes' kind of world of text has been imagined here through miscellaneity. The editor here notes the case of the reviews, which rely heavily on excerpting from the books being discussed. Part of the value of the review in the early 19th century, and arguably long thereafter, is its extensive excerpting. A review reprints the essentials so that you don't really have to go off and read the actual book. That goal of finding the essential parts of a text, of reducing a larger text to its essential bits, the kernel rather than the shell or the husk, is the goal of miscellaneity. And the argument here is that this practice extends from the heavy quarterlies with their reliance on excerpts to the cheap with their specific scissors and paste mode of production. Everyone plunders in their different ways. This practice of scissors and paste journalism, while integral to serial print culture across the century, wasn't the only form of miscellaneous selection to be done. While various forms of serials were engaged in excerpting, readers too reused and repurposed the public world of print for their more private domestic reasons through various modes of scrapbooking. As Brian Maidman has shown so persuasively, the scrap has an important place in the social history of visual culture, and his thinking about miscellaneous scraps has been enormously generative to my own. As he describes them, scraps were an aspect of commercial printmaking in the 1820s, 1830s, and 1840s, and comprised images deliberately produced either in sheets or as small separate images in the expectation that they would be cut out and reassembled as decorative pages in albums or scrapbooks. He also notes that the scrap has conventionally not been a subject of serious literary study. And partly, I think that's because it's very difficult for literary critics to know what to do with texts that are apparently incomplete or that are presented primarily as bits of information or compressed parts of larger texts. 19th century readers, however, were less circumspect and more imaginative than most literary critics. And the huge popularity for scrapbooking across the century attests not only to the centrality of the scrap in public culture, but also to the ways readers use scraps to mediate the public and the private or domestic, and the cultural and gendered politics connected to that mediation. Ellen Gruber Garvey, who's written extensively about scrapbooking in the American context, helpfully points out that this practice was in part a way of managing the abundance of print, of seriality. I won't read all of this, just the beginning. She writes, readers adapted to this proliferation of print by cutting it up and saving it, reorganizing it, and sometimes recirculating it. What she goes on to talk about here and discuss are the ways that scrapbooking is connected to other forms of 19th century cataloging or systems of document, data, and information management. And then she goes on to link that to the web and various forms of web management that exist today. RSVP's very own Alexis Easley notes that the scrapbook is a term coined in 1825, and she says, what was new about the scrapbook was its repurposing of the ephemera of popular print culture. In a scrapbook, an article on floral arrangement might be juxtaposed with a humorous poem or a paragraph about the vagaries of love, materials cut or copied from periodicals and arranged in a personally meaningful order. the selection and arrangement of scraps came to be associated with feminine domestic culture, serving as both a leisure activity and a creative outlet. Miscellaneous columns were likewise designed to appeal to female readers and often served as a major source of content for scrapbooking. The cheap weekly periodical, the miscellaneous column, and the scrapbook thus co-evolved as interdependent genres. Alexis's point about the interdependence and co-evolution of genres, and by extension, I think, the interdependence of forms and formats, is an absolutely crucial one. I think when I began to think about miscellaneity, I wondered, when did it begin and where did it start? But the point, I think, is that it's a case of it's always already. What I'm trying to see across the breadth of the 19th century, if you like, is not an origin story about miscellaneity, rather the import of its function in print. Alexis suggests there is an ecology of print at work here, in which forms, formats, and genres borrow from each other, both in print and in the uses of that print in scrapbooking. So what both Garvey and Easley to see is how miscellaneity lends itself to a kind of systemization in one way or another. And that miscellaneity is both an individual practice connected to things like identity, I think, and a wider cultural technique or process. Given the promiscuity of miscellaneous practice across forms, it's perhaps not a surprise then that the word scrap features in titles of serials, at least since the beginning of the century. The miscellaneous book Scrapiana, or Elegant Extracts of Wit, published in 1818, is a case in point, or here's the Scrapbook of Literary Varieties from 1831, which is another example. And that arrow in the right column points to one of the regular departments in the scrapbook, which is called the Gleanings department. Gleanings pointing to the kind of miscellaneous kind of gathering up of leftover things, which is one of the ways that miscellaneity gets thought about, I think. This is a point that Garvey makes. All of this is to say that by the early decades of the 19th century, miscellaneity as a form was everywhere, but also as a process or method. And that's really what I'm trying to get at today. It isn't, I think, something that increases incrementally across the century in terms of significance. Rather, I see it as something that's absolutely integral to serial print itself. Let me take a leap now to the end of the century, but to try to continue to map out this concept as it emerges through print innovations in the 1880s and 1890s. So what I'm really interested in here is noticing and understanding how miscellaneity sort of imports its techniques and systems of brevity, of selection, of compression into print, right? This idea of miscellaneity as process, and then seeing where this takes us by the end of the century. Let's start with a period to us all. Probably it's called Tit-Bits, launched in 1881. It's an enormously successful spawner of many imitations in Britain and abroad. And here's what they say in their prospectus. There is no paper in the world conducted on the lines which will be followed in Tit-Bits. It will be a production of all that is most interesting in the books, periodicals, and newspapers of this and other countries. Opinions may differ as to whether it is fair for newspapers to use other people's writings so extensively as has now become the practice. That's the triumph of scissors and paste, if you like. Whatever fault may be found by some with this wholesale abstracting, in the case of Tit-Bits, it is at any rate done openly and avowedly, and no attempt is made to pass off extracts as original compositions. There is scarcely a newspaper which does not give some extracts. A complete system has been arranged whereby all the most interesting papers and books of England, France, Germany, Italy, Russia, America, Australia, and the Indies will be regularly searched, and whatever is found of interest to the general reader, in short, wherever a tidbit is discovered, it will be drafted into the new paper. As Kate Jackson has described the periodical, Titbits was a 16-page patchwork of advice, humorous anecdotes, romantic fiction, statistical information, historical explanation, advertisement, legal detail, quips and queries, and reader correspondence. There were also hugely popular competitions and all sorts of reader engagement activity through things like puzzles. Furthermore, Jackson suggests that Titbits reduced the complexities of modern life, distilling and synthesizing information relevant to its readers. Or as another critic, Stephen Donovan, puts it, it had been conceived specifically as an ultra-compressive literary format. Humorous micro-narratives, one-page short stories, snippet-length extracts, nuggets of useful information, and tidbits of every conceivable kind. Interestingly, like Miscellaneous earlier in the century, Titbits is self-conscious. It's very aware about its method, but it emphasizes it as one of the key innovations of the periodical, or it emphasizes one key innovation of the periodical, and that's its role as an abstractor, right? The role of abstraction, and it points to its own systemization of miscellaneous items. So it sees what it's doing as producing as part of an organized system, as it says. The introductory prospectus column ends with a nod to Matthew Arnold and his essay, The Function of Criticism at the Present Time, from 1864. Titbits writes, it will be the business of the conductor of Titbits to find out from this immense field of literature the best things that have ever been said or written, and weekly to place them before the public for 1 penny. This is striking and more than a little cheeky for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because of Arnold's denigration of the mass press, expressed most famously a few years later in 1887 in his article Up to Easter. The launch of Titbits heralding precisely the kind of new journalism, that's Arnold's coinage, of course, that Arnold came to see as a threat to the timeless, lasting, non-ephemeral category of culture. As Jackson describes it, Titbits made hugely popular a reading culture of digest and of manufactured synthesis. That synthetic coming together, I think, is important and partly the result of those processes of abstract, systematized thinking. Richard Menke, writing about Titbits, explores the link to Arnold further, and he finds some overlap in Arnold's use of excerpting and Titbits' use of extracting and abstracting. Arnold uses excerpts from great literary works as what he calls touchstones, which are analogous to Titbits' use of the extract as a unifying cultural experience. As Menke observes, Arnold's touchstones figure the dynamics of appropriation, abstraction, and self-sufficiency that constitute the practice and power of excerpting itself as a critical and cultural exercise. It is through forms of extraction that a kind of imagined cultural cohesion takes place, I suggest, whether that culture is imagined as high or as popular. This leads me, as many roads often do these days, to the Review of Reviews from 1890, a periodical that I just keep circling, which I can't seem to leave alone or ever quite figure out. Founded in 1890 by W.T. Stead and, in fact, George Nunes, who founds Titbits, though they fall out and Nunes leaves shortly thereafter. It's founded with a sort of reformist agenda, and it's connected to Stead's vision of a global network of print under his imprint. It also had sister publications, if you like. In 1892, an American version was published out of New York. That's the image on the right. And in 1893, an edition was published out of Melbourne. In other words, what Stead's trying to set up here is a global and organized system or network of serial print extraction. Here's what Stead writes in the prospectus, and note how familiar it is to almost everything else we've seen in prospectuses so far in this talk. This is what Stead says: of the making of magazines, there is no end. There are already more periodicals than anyone can find time to read. That is why I have today added another one to the list. For the newcomer is not a rival, but rather an index and a guide to all those already in existence. In the mighty maze of modern periodical literature, the busy man wanders confused, not knowing exactly where to find the precise article that he requires, and often after losing all his scanty time in the search, he departs, unsatisfied. It is the object of the review of reviews to supply a clue to that maze in the shape of a readable compendium of all the best articles in the magazines and reviews. He goes on to say, all but the supremely excellent fades into oblivion and is forgotten. The first step towards remembering what is worthwhile, storing in the mind, is to forget that which is worthless lumber. The work of winnowing away the chaff. Keep that word winnowing in mind because we're going to see it again in a minute. The work of winnowing away the chaff and of revealing the grain is the humble but useful task of the editorial thresher. The review of reviews will honestly endeavor to represent the best that is said on all questions in the magazines and reviews of the current month. By now, in the century, Stead's points are both familiar, for example, the need to manage the accumulation of print, and they're innovative, his use of the index as a periodical format, in effect, and his straightforward articulation of the periodical as a means of storage, a place of cultural memory against what gets forgotten. And there's a whole discussion I think we could have here about forgetting and loss attached to miscellaneity, which I haven't gone into, but I'm happy to talk about later if anyone wants to. There is also here the clear echo of Arnold, yet again, an appeal to the best that's been thought and said. That alignment with Arnold is less about content or specific material than it is about process. So he's not interested in the same touchstones at the level of content, but what seems to be happening is that there's a mirroring of process here, of extractive process. Here we see various parts of the magazine. So you can see the different forms of extraction work. The image on the left is excerpts from German periodicals. The image on the right is the beginning of what becomes a compressed version of Twain's Yankee in the Court of King Arthur. Here we've got three other versions of the extractive information, leading articles from the reviews, art in the magazines, which is effectively a kind of selective contents list from various art magazines. There's selections from other magazines on the right. Then we have a kind of graph, a table of information, which is a supply of literature to workhouses connected to a kind of philanthropic project that the magazine's connected to. We also have the new books, which is a regular department of new books and blue books of the month. So lots of different ways in which things are kind of indexed, listed, digested, reduced. One of the things that sets the review of reviews apart from another publication like Tidbits is that Stead's periodical was a monthly. Jim Mussel's written about the temporality of the review of reviews, comparing Stead's montliness to his dailiness, most notably in the evening newspaper, the Pall Mall Gazette. And as Jim notes, the review of reviews was retrospective, but it repackaged the past for the present. And significantly, as a monthly, it was making a bid for a global English-speaking readership. If anything published in London is to be read throughout the English-speaking world, it must be a monthly, Stead writes. But Stead's global reach is enabled, I think, not just through its periodicity, but also through its miscellaneity. In the first issue of the Review of Reviews, after his prospectus, he published an article called To All English-Speaking Folk, in which he linked his publishing project to the broader context of imperialism and progress, if you like. Stead's imperialism is a complicated matter. He rails against jingoism. He's also a certain kind of reformer, but he's also in no doubt that London is at the center of a globalizing world of progress led by English-speaking peoples. And the march of that progress partly involves the civilizing of other people. This is what he says in this article to all English-speaking folk. Among all the agencies for the shaping of the future of the human race, none seems so potent now and still more hereafter as the English-speaking man. Already he begins to dominate the world. The empire and the republic comprise within their limits almost all the territory, the overflow of the world. Their citizens, with all their faults, are leading the van of civilization. And if any great improvements are to be made in the condition of mankind, they will necessarily be leading instruments in the work. Hence, our first starting point will be a deep and almost awestruck regard for the destinies of the English-speaking man. He then goes on to discuss how best to equip the individual citizen for his work in this global imperial project. The role of the Review of Reviews is to mediate this global world for the dominant English-speaking people. He says to interpret to the English-speaking race the best thought of the other peoples is one among the many services which we seek to render to the empire, we, the Review of Reviews. He concludes this quite sort of complicated article in its way, but he concludes it by saying this: our supreme duty is the winnowing out by a process of natural selection. There's that word winnowing out again, which he says is one of the functions, if you like, of the Review of Reviews. Our supreme duty is the winnowing out by a process of natural selection and enlisting for hardy service for the commonweal all those who possess within their hearts the sacrificed fire, patriotic devotion to their country. The whole problem is to discover the wise few and to place the scepter in their hands and loyally to follow their leading. But how to find them out? That is the greatest of questions. Our supreme task is to help to discover these. So our supreme task as periodical is to help to discover these wise ones, to afford them opportunity of articulate utterance, to do what we can to make their authority potent among their contemporaries. And it concludes the article by saying, to establish a periodical circulating throughout the English-speaking world with its affiliates or associates in every town and its correspondents in every village, read as men used to read their Bibles, not to waste an idle hour, but to discover the will of God and their duty to man, whose staff and readers alike are bound together by a common faith and a readiness to do common service for a common end. That, indeed, is an object for which it is worthwhile to make some sacrifice. Such a publication so supported would be at once an education and an inspiration. And who can say, looking at the present condition of England and of America, that it is not needed? This is heady stuff, enabled partly by the vision of a single man, W.T. Stead, an extraordinary sort of figure in many ways, an innovator and a maverick in serial development, for whom a network of extractive print culture is one of the things that might connect us all, at least those of us English-speaking folk. However, this vision is also enabled, I think, by the logic of those twin engines of print modernity, seriality and miscellaneity. Let me introduce one final serial to consider by way of heading to a conclusion. This time, it's an American annual in the newspaper press directory genre. This is Hubbard's paper and bank directory of the world. And this is what they say in their preface, which is published in various languages. "'Tis done, and each and every page of copy was new matter, plowed up, dug out, or hewn from more kinds and styles of soil and material, from more quarters of the globe than characterize any other book in existence. Without disposition to boast, the publisher may yet say, with truth, that his success is unparalleled. No such work, either as a whole or in part, has ever before been attempted." Well, like every other press directory since their invention in the 1840s, Hubbard's value was in the processes of extraction and abstraction. of compressing huge amounts of data and presenting it as information, which could then be used by the media industry, an increasingly integrated industry represented by those lists, the indices, the tables, the graphs, the charts, the maps, and the other forms of compression that we find in its pages. After the title page in the inaugural volume, Hubbard produced a facsimile of a letter dedicated to the President of the United States, Chester Arthur, not a president I remembered, I have to say, and to Queen Victoria. And this is what Hubbard writes. Representative, it's sort of in his own hand, representative heads of the great English-speaking nations of the earth, whose 100 millions of people having the same origin, the same language, and the same standards of civilization, occupy the front rank among the instrumentalities for the enlightenment of mankind. Also, to the gifted intellects, willing hearts, and dexterous fingers engaged in making the great art a blessing to the people of the world. Our most potent agency is the periodical press, issuing 5,000 millions of copies annually, which, spread broadcast over the world, give light to those in darkness and liberty to the oppressed. Well, this is a decade before Stead's Review of Reviews. It's a year after the launch of Titbits. But each of these serials, the weekly Titbits, the monthly Review of Reviews, and the annual Hubbards, each in their different ways projects a unified, aggregate world of bits and pieces. The logic and the language of extraction, of selectivity, of reduction, provides a way of holding forth against the abundance of print modernity, offering reassurances that readers won't get lost in the maze of print, and by offering them the essentials, the kernel, rather than the shell of what you need to know. Let me return to these questions, not with a view to answering them, but by way of concluding in a speculative sort of way. By the end of the century, miscellaneity has been systematized, information stored and recirculated, reimagined, repurposed. A range of what we might think of as compressive aesthetics emerges in print culture, some of which serial innovations we've saw glimpses of in some of the slides today. And those compressive aesthetics, those new forms and formats of seriality and miscellaneity, are linked to what we might think of as the broader liberal project in the 19th century. These new popular serials, with their systematizing of bits and pieces, curiously align with Arnold. They are also aligned with people like John Stuart Mill, but curiously aligned with Arnold, both of whom project an illusion of unity, or at least an image of unity. For Arnold, there is a projected unity through the high culture touchstones, which help mitigate against his claims of anarchy. For our miscellaneous serials, it is no less a kind of bringing together of readers in a global world of print. English-speaking readers, that is. Both these liberal illusions of unity, through their processes of excerpt and extract, underpin the fantasy of the easy, seamless, global spread of print and communication, which itself, I think, underpins the fantasy of empire. In the systemization and abstraction of material, we see a process at work, a way of delimiting and managing abundance, but also a way of making the individual a part of a cohesive but much larger whole. So what I'm wondering is how we conceptualize print in relation, for example, to forms of colonialism of the kind that Stead introduces, or the kind that Hubbard's implicitly talks about. In what ways do the methods, processes, and techniques of print, of serial expansion and miscellaneous extraction, for example, in what ways do these enable, help circulate, or represent, or abstract these larger political and cultural forces? I'll just end with a question. Those metaphors of plowing and digging up of the soil from the quarters of the globe that we see in Hubbard's descriptions of extractive miscellaneity, and we see similar ones elsewhere, or the systematized process of winnowing, which is akin to natural selection that Stead talks about. How far might they resonate with the processes of extractive colonialism around the globe, itself a violent version of extracting of the best and leaving the rest behind? That's it. Thank you. I will stop sharing.
Oh, Mark, fabulous. Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm kind of blown away by that. Those kind of messianic editorial statements we were getting towards the end there, and the kind of biblical resonances too of some of those metaphors that you were pointing out.
Particularly Stead, yeah.
Yeah, really bring home the scope of what they were attempting, and of course raise very interesting questions about other forms of extraction, as you say. I was thinking about the recent book on extractive mining and so on, and I suppose the metaphors to do with winnowing, arguably a more sustainable form of extraction, but extraction nevertheless. Please add your questions either to the chat or raise your hand, and I will do my best to spot you. I can't fit everybody on my screen, so if somebody has a hand up, just be persistent if I haven't noticed you yet. But perhaps I could start. Oh, yes, Maria, go ahead. Would you like to unmute yourself?
Thank you so much, Mark. That was wonderful. I was wondering if you could say a little bit something that has been been of huge interest to me with this material is what do you think the result is, or do these writers address the results of the shuffling or the randomization of information? I mean, the fact that it is presented in a serialized form that does not necessarily have that, I mean, the lack of internal cohesion in a way of all of these different bits and pieces and touchstones.
No, I don't think they do, but partly because I don't think it's in their interest to do it. I mean, clearly, many of these miscellanies are a mess, right? And they're not systematic in their way. They're made to look systematic, or they're made to be thought about as systematic. It's tricky, but they're not necessarily systematized in the way that they're put together. That's why I think the scrapbook is a useful kind of early way of thinking about miscellaneity, because it represents something, but it may not represent systemization as such. But the claim to systemization is always there. So I think they have to feel like there's a system at work, even if that system isn't logical at the level of the tidbit, of the level of each bit in the piece. And so again, this is something that sort of Jim writes really well about. That's one of the things we need those departments for. It's one of those things we need regular fonts for. We need all of that stuff to produce the illusion that this stuff is seamless and that there's a seamless system at work. And so by trying to put different kinds of magazines sort of horizontally alongside each other, so the press directory alongside a weekly or a monthly, and trying to point out a kind of set of processes that are at work. I'm hoping what we can see is, on the one hand, this sort of need to make it appear as if there's a constant seamlessness about it. But of course, what we always find are the seams and the places where the things don't add up or where things go wrong. But I think there's a need to project a kind of unity, even though there's this constant tension between the serial and the miscellaneous item, if you see what I mean. I don't know if that quite answers your question, Maria, but good.
I see Claire's put a comment in the chat. Claire, do you want to unmute yourself and say something about that?
Yeah, I can do. As I say, it definitely isn't a question, so I don't like to sort of fill the conversation time. But I think the feeling, as you were talking so brilliantly about these ideas of winnowing, selecting, extracting, really resonates to me about how I feel often when I'm working with 19th century periodicals today, and that how far any kind of extracting of quotes from large quantities of periodical material is an act of creating miscellany, but then we try and paper over the seams and create a coherent scholarly argument. But as I say, this may be my own anxieties about methodologies not being systematic enough, but I wondered if that resonated with others.
I have a feeling they're not anxieties that are unique to you, Claire. So don't worry about that. I think the anxiety is produced by the nature of the material we look at. The similar kind of thing that I was thinking about when I would work on this is, and it's not a fight that we sort of fight, it's this fight that we sort of won, I think, in periodical studies, but we used to always rail against stop mining the periodicals. Don't just, we'd always be angry at historians for mining something, or angry at a literary critic for going into a magazine and yanking a poem out. We'd be like, stop mining. And yet, there's a weird logic to the periodical, which is about a kind of endless mining. That's what the thief tells us early on, is it's all there for plunder. It's all there to be nicked. And what I think we do in periodical studies is we find a method, and those methods are sometimes looking at a single issue, sometimes looking at an editor, sometimes looking at a run, sometimes looking at an author, sometimes looking at a network of print. In other words, there are ways we have of entering into the study of this unruly material, but it's somehow always produces a certain kind of anxiety, I think. Yeah.
Elizabeth Tilley, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, this is a visual one.
I won't. Sorry, I'm still kind of drinking my soup here.
Oh, sorry.
I'm just wondering, is the thing that unites a particular title and unites across titles a visual kind of seamlessness, where the content can't be shown to be anything other than bitty. There is a look of the page that draws things together.
Yeah, that's yeah. And I think that's part of what. When I was quoting Jim, he was talking about appearances. That's one of the things that reassures us, is that by by looking at the thing, we know what it is, right? And that by looking at departments and by looking at so one of the interesting things, you have a department like Gleanings, and it's always there, and it's always the last page. And Gleanings, in a sense, means here's the place where everything's a bunch of messy bits. Yeah. So it's like, here's the organized bit of disorganization, if you like. It's like
the repetition is the organizing principle.
And the word Gleanings is the thing that goes, okay, well, at least I know where the messy stuff is.
Yeah.
Right. It acts visually on the page. And yeah, I mean, periodicals both do and don't do that. I think one of the things that when a number of us here who worked on the 19th century serials edition kind of realized is, there are formats, but a format just needs to shift a little bit to be difficult to read, right? Once the department changes pages, it shifts around. But I think you're right. I think all those things, the visual look of the page, as well as the title and all of that, I think hold it together in a way.
Thanks.
So we've got questions from Matt Poland and then Michael Hancher. Matt?
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, yep. We can.
Fabulous. I wanted to go back to the point you raised at the end, Mark, about periodicals and the kind of wider cultural dynamics of colonialism. And I think Kathy actually mentioned the book that I was going to mention, Liz Miller's book about extraction ecologies. And I think one of the interesting things that Liz talks about so well is the ways that the extraction plays out with anxieties about depleting resources, and so there's this kind of dialectical force in the discourse about the back and forth between expansion and the possibility of kind of resource exhaustion, and so I wonder if one way to think about that, and this is really the question, is do Stead or any of the other periodical editors that you're writing about ever worry about running out of material? Is that part of the dynamic, which might be a parallel to those wider colonial discourses and dynamics?
Yeah, it's a really good point. Not that I can think of, right? Or not these versions of periodicals anyway, because these versions seem so intent on projecting abundance, because that's their justification for them being there, is to manage the abundance for you. But that's an interesting suggestion. Is there kind of like print exhaust? I mean, there is a sense in which, in say Stead's indexing, you're not necessarily producing anything new. You're simply managing everything else that's out there, right? So it's not, as it were, adding to the amount. It's taking from all the amount that's out there, repackaging it, turning it into something else, which of course you then consume. But it's not quite the same as what you're talking about, though, or what's in that book, which is a really fine book.
It's the services economy version.
Yeah,
You're not anything new. You're just
I don't know if anyone else has other examples, but I can't think of any where it's about depletion rather than abundance.
Mm-hmm. Michael, then Preethi, then back to Maria.
I have a question about managing the abundance of information. At the end of the century, there's obviously too much. The scrapbooking examples that you give earlier show private efforts to manage this information rather than the public, which the serials are doing. And that makes me think back to the older tradition, 17th century tradition of commonplacing, where the same problem of overload, information overload, managing that overload is personal and done in manuscript. And I guess my question is, are habits of abstraction that are used by commonplacers in the 17th and 18th century personally, do they resonate in significant ways with the public abstraction that you're working towards at the end of the 19th century? It's a long reach from the 17th, from John Locke into the end of the 19th century, but are there similar continuing problems and strategies?
I think, yeah, I kind of removed a very brief section here, which sort of looks backwards, or at least acknowledges that longer tradition, if you like, because I guess part of the logic of my argument is that once you have seriality, you've got miscellaneity. Whereas once you have the newspaper in the 1690s, it's miscellaneous. Right. It's shipping news, it's various kinds of information, it's telling you what's happening in Antwerp, it's a miscellaneous thing. And so seriality and miscellaneity are always together. They're always, and they find different forms at different periods. The commonplace book, the anthology, various kinds of pocketbooks, they take different forms. So the argument isn't that seriality and miscellaneity sort of emerge in the 19th century, I guess. And yet, I guess what I'm interested in thinking about is what do they do in the 19th century, or what happens, as you say, when they become attached to a particular kind of public discourse, when in this case, a particular discourse in the late 19th century in which the discourse of colonialism is I don't quite know the verb to use. Is it carried through this dynamic? Is it produced through this? Is it enabled through this dynamic? So I guess partly I'm interested in the different historical moments at which these techniques are imported into a culture and seeing what happens at those different kind of moments. I think one of the things you might say is that there's one of the things that we see in scrapbooking is a kind of subjectivity at work, right? A kind of, there's a subject doing something, creating something, and making something, and there's a sense by the late 19th century that these periodicals are producing a liberal subject of which you are invited to be a part. Right? It's kind of creating a late 19th century liberal subjecthood for its readers.
And doing the work for them. The old commonplacer had to do the work herself.
Yeah, and it's that word, I mean, the interesting word in one of those paragraphs instead is common. Right. So it's a new kind of common, new in quotes, right. I'm not sure, new in question marks, new kind of common that gets produced here.
Prithvi?
Thanks so much. Mark, that was just a wonderful paper, and I don't know that I have a question so much as a comment. I really, the sort of question of abundance or information overload, and then depletion or the colonial extraction that you ended with. And so I just wanted to share, I've long wanted to write a piece on the directories, the actual directories, colonial directories, so not press directories, which you talk about. And it was really, I love your work on press directories, but directories of India, which is sort of the place I work in. And they're so peculiar because they're about a certain way of organizing, not just knowledge, but organizing hierarchy.
Yeah.
And so I just, I mean, your work in thinking about how to manage this information overload, this abundance through scissors and paste, scrapbook, that's one, anthologizing, which Leah Price has written about, and then organization of people is another sort of way. So I don't really have a question here. I just really have a comment in bringing in a different kind of directory, but any thoughts you might have, which is not just organizing of information, but organizing of people, because I happen to be obsessed with these directories of people in the colonies, will be great.
I mean, I don't, except to say thank you, because I think when I gestured to the larger background of this project, I mean, the context of this is really thinking about different forms of print innovation, and those moments of print innovation in which allow us to see something happening. And so what I'm kind of interested in doing is kind of collecting versions of this. But there's a colleague I was talking about who was talking about, the early, I guess sort of early, well, late 19th century, but kind of ethnographic books which start to use photography as, records, as documents of people and documents of cultures. And he was talking about the way in which, you could think about photography, you could think about some of these seriality, which is about repetition and standardization, right, at one level, and miscellaneity, which is about randomness. And you could think about the way in which those two kind of concepts, if you like, organize the way in which the knowledge in those books around how people and other cultures are represented kind of align with some of these kind of ideas that I guess I'm arguing come out of print. So that might be another kind of example, but your colonial directories, press directories, indexes, all of these different forms of compression, I guess is the umbrella word I'd probably put on top of this. These are all forms of compression. And what's interesting about all forms of compression is that they produce forms of loss. Something always gets lost in compression, right? You compress something, and when you open it up, there's always a lossiness. That's what philosophers of compression talk about. And so it's interesting to think about in your hierarchies, for example, what gets lost in this compressed form of colonial directory.
Could I just quickly say that I actually don't think the colonial directories are a form of compression. I actually think they're a form of expansion because, just at least the ones I've seen, they collect information by different classes, if you will. So there's a print, there's a section on presses of Calcutta, and John Lang might be listed there. But then there's a section on folks who live in Agra, and John Lang might be listed there again, right? So there's a way in which they actually are a little bit, they're not abundance in the way that you're thinking, but I'm not sure that they are compression either. And it kind of feels to me like they are, they are certainly a form of print innovation, but how they're somewhere in between those two poles that you've identified for us.
No, that's interesting. I mean, because at some level, when I look at some of these pages, I just think, what's being represented here? What is this a representation of? So rather than the content, but what's actually being is something being represented, or is something being abstracted, or are both of those things happening? I like that example because it's a great example of not being able to organize that guy. So he has to go here and he has to go there, right? It's the messiness of data management, if you like. Thank you for that example, though.
Any other questions? Can I just ask to go back to those amazing statements from the editors? I mean, was the role that is involved in the processes of extraction and selection and whatnot, does this feed into any changing conceptualization of the editorial function later in the century? Because it's a kind of much more, well, it's a different role, isn't it, from just commissioning pieces or, working out the arrangement of an issue or something. You really are, as you say, excluding in quite a significant way.
And that's a really good question. I mean, and I kind of want to say this is all, editors are always about excluding in some way. Yes. They're always about making choices, and they're always about cutting things out and managing that in such a way that it looks like you're given a full picture of something. That's part of the sort of sleight of hand of the editorial function, is that it produces cohesion daily or weekly or monthly or whatever. So I kind of feel like, so what you see in say the sort of early stuff in the early 19th century, like The Thief, is the editor just admitting that that's what happens. Right, and just sort of said, this is what we do. We cut things, we steal things, we reassemble them, and that's what print seems to do. That's what book reviews do. That's what books. We're all at it.
So maybe a sort of demystification of the role as much as anything else.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of mystification of the role, certainly in the 19th century, going on as well, right? And that's around the editorial we, right? The strength of that voice and the power of the aggregate. It's the power of that aggregate, but it's the power of an aggregate that relies on selectivity, brevity, extraction, those bits and pieces. So it's a kind of that sort of unity of that aggregate of bits, which is, I think, the thing that sort of interests me. And that's where liberalism comes in, because that's one way of thinking. That's what Mill is worried about, is how do we preserve the idiosyncratic individual and also manage the social whole, and those kinds of capital L liberal questions, I guess.
I think we should let you go and have a large drink after such an amazing talk for us. I'm going to ask people to unmute themselves so that you can actually hear the appreciation. Would you all please join me in thanking Mark for an absolutely fabulous Wolff lecture?
Thank you. Thanks for coming. Nice to see you.
We'll see you tomorrow, everyone.
See you and on. Yeah. Cheers. Bye.
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 Bye.